better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, as I have said at least 1,000,000 times through my ministry, obviously he is not being literal there, but he is in fact stating an incredible truth that says, wherever your mind goes, wherever your heart goes, your body will ultimately follow. And then he gets into divorce, non-controversial subject, right? Verse 31, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual morality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who married a divorced woman commits adultery. By the way, that is broadly, significantly different than what the Bible scholars, quote, the religious scholars of the day would say about divorce. I'm not going to talk more about the oaths there, except to simply say what you say, do, and what you do, say, and match that up, and be careful what you say. So let's look at embracing imperfection. Our progress toward what I would call perfection / wholeness, being whole in our lives, begins with being honest about our imperfections. It begins there. How many of you really don't like your imperfections? How many of you, your friends and family would say they strive with a level of perfectionism in their life that is probably unhealthy? I could pick out about 10 of you because I know you that well. A couple of you could say, Dan, you do some of the same, don't we? I always love it when research tells us what Jesus has been saying for a long, long time. Research of a couple, Yale and Toronto, University of Toronto, a couple of those brainwave guys got together, and they did this study. They did a series of lab studies, and what they found out is that people tend to be afraid of making and admitting mistakes. Anybody recognize that? We tend to lean away from admitting or even acknowledging that there's a mistake. And so what they did in their experiment was they had a group of people read a review on a particular product. In this case, it was a brand of headphones. And in the first review, they just didn't say anything bad about the product. In the second one, they did say that there had been a problem with them along the way, but that it had been corrected. 79% of the people who read the first review with no complaints leaned toward getting that product. But in the one where it admitted that there had been a mistake, 93% of the people who read that leaned toward getting the product. In other words, honesty about imperfections made the reviewer more trustworthy. 3 other experiments were done, like mints and flora service. They all proved the same, and that is that it appears that people who are honest about their mistakes are seen as more credible. Now, there is a difference, and I'll just earmark this, between whining about all of your mistakes, about living in your imperfections, and just wallowing in knowing that you'll never get any better. Now, that's not what we're talking about here. It is an honest acknowledgement that we, in fact, do not make all the right decisions all the time. And living out of that sense of honesty does incredible things for us. It's surprising for those who are not believers, I guess, that confession actually builds trust. Now, earmark that, check that. Confession actually builds a kind of trust in us. Jesus would agree with that. We just read it a moment ago. If you are offering your gift at the altar, remember be honest about it. In other words, if you're going to get serious with me, the reconciliation opportunities will be often, because I am going to sensitize your heart in a way that will encourage, allow, and in fact insist upon you being honest with others. Confess your sin. Admit your mistake. Give your gift to God. That's literally what he says here. Because for Jesus, nothing is more important, exclamation point, nothing is more important to Jesus than reconciliation. The resolution of disputes, and I use that word carefully, because most of the disputes that we have, most of the uneasiness, most of the disagreements we have will not be perfectly resolved. When's the last time you had a disagreement and you both came together, had a kumbaya moment, and you said, no, it was me, and they said, no, it was, yes, it was you. I mean, you know what I'm saying. You just can't, there's never really that moment where we perfectly resolve it. So what do we do with it if we don't? We reconcile it. We say, you're more important to me than this problem. Matter of fact, what was the problem? We get to a point where we even forget what it was. Because in most cases, it wasn't nearly as important as we are. The kind of honesty, the keys to avoiding the other problems, Jesus says, committing adultery, all that list there. He says, be honest. Let your yes be a yes, let your no be a no, but be honest with each other. Because confession builds trust, and reconciliation is the most important thing that Jesus talks about. Not only being reconciled to him, obviously, through Christ to his Father, but to be reconciled with each other. So secondly, the path to reconciliation. Jesus knows better than anyone else about what it takes to live a perfect life, or in our case, I don't ever use the word perfect, but a whole life, because perfection outside of Jesus is impossible. Think of the story in Genesis where Jacob, in fact, had an all-night wrestling session with God, and one of the conclusions of his all-night wrestling session was what? To go to his brother Esau and to, in fact, reconcile. What he was surprised to know is that reconciliation was a grace-filled one. The result was that Esau showed him grace. The best human connections are made at the point not of flexing our muscles and showing our strength, but the best human connections are always shown at a point of vulnerability. And that's true not only then, but now. I have been reading about a story that my historical mind kind of wrapped itself around this. I may have gotten a little too involved in it, but I'd never heard of this. You're going to see a picture of it, Reconciliation Parish. That's an interesting building, I will tell you, not only in its looks, but in its history. It's a parish now, and I think it's interesting they don't use the word church, and you will know why when you know this story. There was a Church of Reconciliation that was on the line of East and West Berlin. And so we have a video, it's about a 2-minute video, that will show you what happened to the church that was caught in that moment.
A church stands in no man's land, caught between East and West Berlin. Abandoned since the wall went up, it is a reminder of the division and a thorn in the SED's side. The church is demolished on the 22nd of January, 1985. It is a sad day for East Berlin pastor Johannes Hildebrand. His father had preached here week in, week out, until the wall was erected. We lived close to the church because of my father's job. He always got us involved so that we'd stay out of trouble. He'd say, "You do the clock, you do the bells." So the church was really just an extension of our home. Locked in the death strip, the church begins to crumble, as does any interest in preserving it. The church eventually hands it over to the GDR. In return, the state builds a community center in the new Hohenschönhausen district. Johannes and his father protest against the move. We tried to tell the bishop that what he was doing was wrong, that the building wasn't just a symbol of reconciliation, but also a church, one that had been built by a group of devout Christians and not by church officials.
Ja nicht von den Kirchenfunktionären errichtet worden ist, sondern von einer Gruppe von gläubigen Christen.
But the church dignitaries think the wall is here to stay, that a church in the death strip is useless and not a place of active faith. Demolition is realized as planned. The area around is sealed off. Johannes wants to say goodbye to his church, so he fakes a permit that gets him into the sealed off zone. They said they'd never seen a document like that before. And I said, well, churches don't get demolished all that often. I had very mixed feelings that day. I was angry at everyone who had helped this happen, the church officials above all. And I was also watching part of my home disappear. Those were the things going through my head.
I read that, watched that. It's one of the most incredible, sad things I've seen. I couldn't help but think about, Neva and I were in Nashville, and I pastored First Baptist Church Nashville, and they have very much that steeple thing that you saw falling there, that sits on, very similar, sits on the corner of where that church owns about 2 or 3 blocks there. It's the original part of the church that has been maintained. And when Nashville began to change through the years, now granted it wasn't a war, but there was a financial war going on. All around us, the arena was being built, all the stuff. And if you're not aware, Nashville has doubled in size in the last 12 years. That piece of land that sits there next to the arena, I cannot tell you how much that piece of property is worth. In the back of my brain, I keep wondering when it's going to happen that somebody's going to come in and say, no, you need to be out of downtown. I don't think they will, because that church has enough money. I think God lent them enough money to make it through. But I think about it because of the incredible reconciliation that took place after this in order for those people to get through and to rebuild a parish there. If you look at the picture of it, obviously I got very involved looking at the picture. I kept noticing down in front of the building that I showed you originally, there was a statue, a little piece of artwork. This is that I found out what that artwork was. Isn't that one of the most powerful images you've ever seen? If somebody could make one of those, I'd buy it and put it somewhere. Well, maybe, I don't know if I could buy it or not, but I'd probably put it somewhere on our property. Isn't that one of the most powerful things you've ever seen about people reaching together and reconciling? And it all starts with a conversation. It then goes to a place called confession, and it ends with a wonderful thing called forgiveness. As I read about this church reconciling with the neighborhood and with the police officers that were involved, or the army that was involved, and how the neighborhood was hurt by this, I kept thinking of the power of reconciliation. What is it today is if you could not be reconciled to the person because they're no longer living? I get that question often. Dan, you talk a lot about reconciliation, but what if the person's no longer around? Well, talk to them. Say it out loud. Go to their grave. I don't know what you might need to do, but say it out loud. Do not let it stay inside of you. Reconcile. And again, reconcile does not mean that you resolve it all. It means that you're willing to take a step of vulnerability and honesty. New Testament professor by the name of Richard Hayes delves into the word reconciliation. And he said, even in the New Testament, the word is most often used from a political standpoint, that literally it's taken from the politics. Oh God, it couldn't be further from what we're facing today, is it? It refers to dispute resolution. And again, I would remind you that dispute resolving things will not likely happen in most of the situations that we come to. There will not be an equal, I agree about this. There will and can be and must be a reconciliation, a coming together. I mentioned to you earlier the commercial he gets us, and I just almost wept this week as I heard that somebody was arguing about it. They had remained this group that got together and put all these millions of dollars together to do these ads across television. They purposely had remained anonymous because of this very reason. They didn't want people fighting over it, saying, I don't like them, or they're too conservative, or they're too liberal, or whatever it might be. Just let Jesus be known. One of the new things that I abhor is when people say, oh, I don't have any regrets. What I tend to see when people do that is they don't want to admit that what they did was wrong. Particularly you see it with celebrities. Oh, you know, my fourth divorce really wasn't that bad. I mean, I have no regrets from it because, you know, I learned something, and so from that moment on, all is well. And there is not that vulnerability. There is not that acceptance of, I could have done this better. I could have done this different. And so what I most abhor about it is there is no retrospection. There is no looking back. There is no evaluation of their lives. I read the story, simple story. We've had it happen here. Actually, my wife's been involved in one level of it, and that is the forgiveness of library fines. Have you ever had forgiveness of library fines? One day my wife came in, you're not going to believe this, they forgave all of my fines. It was $743. No, it wasn't that bad, but New York City did this. If you can imagine, New York City with all the books and stuff they have, 21,000 overdue or lost items suddenly returned when they offered forgiveness. We are a people who want, seek, and need forgiveness. Even with books. You may know the name John Newton. He was an abolitionist as well as one of the great 18th century's Anglican clerics. I was intrigued as I was reading about it recently that he had this process that he would do on Saturday nights. At 6 o'clock, he would go through 3 steps. It made me think of the days when I first began to be a pastor at Hillgrove Baptist Church in Meade County in Kentucky, our part-time church on the weekends. I would actually go over to the sanctuary. We lived in a little trailer. If we spent the night, we'd come down on Saturday nights sometimes. And I would go over and turn enough of the lights on that I could read my manuscript, and I would preach it out loud. I never let anybody come except the church mouse to hear that Saturday night practicing. But he said he had 3 practices that he did, and they were these. At first he would make 2 lists. And on one side of the list, he'd say, all my blessings are these, and then all of my sins would be on the other one. Omission and commission, the list of sins. But he said the third thing that he did was he looked at that, began to process, look over his shoulder, and let God take care of it, because he would rededicate his life before he walked into that pulpit the next day. I don't know if Pope Francis, my cousin, Pope Francis knows anything about marriage. But I think it was last Christmas, in and around Christmas, he had something he wanted to tell particularly Christian couples. And the simple thing was three things. He said, use these words more often in your marriages. Please, thank you, and sorry. There's probably no more important words than those, is there? When you get over to reading Matthew someday, read it. You're jogging along and everything's good, and then you hit chapter 5, and for 2 chapters you get scared to death because what happens is you run into the wall of the reality of his expectations, hopes, and dreams for his people. Friends, the older I get, the more I'm a Jesus guy. The stuff of religion, I push aside more and more. Somebody said the other day, when my religion gets in the way of my neighbor, I get my religion out of the way. Because I think Jesus wants me to love my neighbor no matter what, no matter who they are. I will tell you that I've spent most of my ministry with this issue of reconciliation. There's something about it with me that's important. I don't do it perfectly, but I try my best to do it. That's why I wrote the book that I wrote. It's why I try to live every week with the load and yet the freedom of living in reconciled relationships. But ultimately it starts, Paul says that we have a ministry of pastor, not just the staff member. So what would it mean for you today to be reconciled? Well, it would mean that you'd have to go about doing some surrendering, wouldn't you? Let's pray together. Father, during these moments when it's really hard, at least in our hearts, to surrender, it's absolutely necessary and, in fact, is a part of what needs to happen. We don't come to church to hold on to stuff. We come to church to let go. And so be with us as we share this final song today. Need confess.
Oh, to Jesus I give my free. His presence. I surrender all.
Oh my. I've been to church. I hope you have been too. It's good to be here today. Good to have you. We have a short benediction today, but one that goes to the point of everything that we've been talking about. Let's say it together. Do not be afraid. God goes with us to build bridges of reconciliation, create communities of acceptance, establish villages of compassion. Go in peace, strengthened by God's blessing. Amen.